delighted to introduce Ciaran Martin to you. He is a Professor of Practice in the Management of Public Organisations in the Blavatnik School of Government here in Oxford. And prior to joining the school, he was the founding Chief Executive of the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is part of GCHQ. And that came at the end of an illustrious career in the civil service. And I'm sure he's going to give us a very interesting insight into how we can get rid of digital pollution. So over to you, Ciaran.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Just checking everybody can hear me. Check out the back and obviously complain online if you can't. Thank you for the honour of your company tonight. I didn't realise it was your Christmas meeting. I don't normally do Christmas parties, and you know, I know other options are available. I just wanted to check, much like at a wedding, you know, everybody's here of their own free will, and there's no lawful impediments and all of that. I hope we can have a good discussion tonight, both those of you in person and those online. They've asked me to speak for a very long time, so do feel free to interrupt. And apologies, I've had some dental surgery today, so apologies if my very thick regional accent is even worse than normal tonight. I was going to try and do four things tonight. First, I was going to set the scene about digital harm. What sort of harms occur online and why? Secondly, I was going to talk a little bit about my own experience of trying to deal with those harms as head of the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, the first one. The third thing I was going to try and do was talk about some trends in cybersecurity and what's driving things. What are people worried about? What opportunities do people see? Because it's a very gloomy subject, but actually we have agency. If you remember nothing else from this talk, is that my view, for what it's worth, is that cybersecurity is a largely but not completely solvable problem. We can certainly take away a lot of the damage a lot of the time. So what are the sort of trends there? And then finally, how do we, to try and finish on that optimistic note, how do we move towards a more secure digital environment? And I'll even speak a little bit about why I use that sort of phraseology. Now, I asked a little bit of the organisers about the audience, and they said gloriously, unhelpfully, even if in a friendly way, they're pretty split between technical and non-technical people. I said, well, that's great, because that means basically everybody, and it's very hard to picture. I just want to be completely honest about who I am. I mean, you've taken the time, and I'm grateful for it, to come and listen to me. I'm not technical at all. I studied at this university 30 years ago, and I studied history. I fell into cybersecurity in government courtesy of a man called Edward Snowden, currently resident in somewhere in Moscow. Because I was a policy fixer who was sent out to help GCHQ manage a political crisis, and that was my experience, and they didn't have that sort of skill set for obvious reasons. And after that, they invited me to stay on and essentially run cybersecurity, run operational cybersecurity for GCHQ. And we were consulting my oldest friend, who said, "But what do you know about computers?" And the answer at the time was nothing. But what was fascinating, I mean, and I argued against my own appointment, but what was fascinating was essentially teaming up with technical experts. And GCHQ had fabulous technical experts. It's just that it was a very enclosed environment, because GCHQ's cybersecurity, or InfoSec securities, as it was called back then, was geared towards protecting military and intelligence assets. It was geared towards cybersecurity protection in a closed environment. Of course, the digital revolution hadn't swept all that away, but it had made cybersecurity a national challenge. It had made it everybody was vulnerable instead of just strategic national security assets, and we couldn't do it from behind the wire anymore. That was part of it. But another key part of it was that a lot of the problems were like things like economics and law and regulation and behavioral science. And so it was a really, really interesting experience. And those are some of the things I want to dwell on tonight. But as I say, I'm not doing it from a technical background. Additionally, I'm not even doing it from what I would see as, as something that is the lead. For me, we learned this lesson painfully. I'll come back to this point later in the story. For me, we learned painfully that if you put cybersecurity as a subject by itself, it fails. If you do it as a supporting function to digital transformation, you've got a chance. And we learned that arguably a bit too late. When I think about where this whole concept of digital pollution comes from, is actually when I first encountered cybersecurity a decade or so ago, almost, everybody was talking about it in government in really militarized terms. It was a domain of operations. NATO formally declared cyberspace a domain of operations in 2014, I think. And that's absolutely right. Of course, it's a domain of operations. I will talk later on about the Ukraine war and what that means for cyber combat, if you like. But it's so much more than a domain of operations. And I think it was the pandemic that taught us this. When you think about the pandemic, I mean, where did we go? We went to two places. One was home and the other was online. And the digital world kept most of us a bit more professionally successful than we would otherwise have been, and a bit more personally sane and able to cope than we would otherwise have been. And so for me, instead of this stuff about talking about cyber as a war zone and a domain of operations as a primary way of talking about it, I like to talk about cyberspace as an environment. It's an artificially created environment. And I think I used to try and make this argument before the pandemic, but I didn't get very far, not even with my own family. Post-pandemic, I think it makes more sense to people that cyberspace is an environment. And whilst I think the concept of viruses, the medical concept of viruses, computer viruses, is quite useful because it tells people that they jump from thing to thing and host to host and so on. That's a really good way of thinking about digital harm if you're in the technical business of trying to defend against it. I also think that the concept of cyberspace as an environment and cyber criminals and state-sponsored malignant actors as basically polluters, and the stuff they inject into the digital environment as pollution is also quite a helpful way of thinking about it. So that's the sort of theme that I'm going to talk about tonight. But it's all from a position of positivity about technology, about the virtues of that digital environment. In fact, I remember, in aeons gone by, in my earlier civil service career before I encountered cybersecurity, I had all sorts of weird jobs, including principal private secretary to the cabinet secretary. For Yes Minister fans, that's Sir Humphrey. I was basically Sir Humphrey's gopher. And you helped to run the honours system. I remember in the Queen's Birthday Honours List of 2020, so the summer one, I was absolutely delighted because they gave a bunch of honours to telecoms engineers. I thought, that's kind of absolutely right, because these were people who climbed poles at 3 a.m. to fix internet access to remote villages during the pandemic. They just kept places going. So there was something, they were key workers, they were heroic, perhaps not as much as frontline health service workers, but there's something absolutely heroic about that for me. And our job, in effect, was to support that by keeping this as safe as possible. Think of how much worse 2020 and 21 would have been if technology had failed, either because the capacity couldn't cope or because the security failed. So we have a digital environment to protect. But why is there so much messing around in that digital environment? So I want to start with, if I had, I spared you slides tonight. I asked the organisers, was I expected to use slides? And I basically got the answer back that you'd be delighted if I didn't. So bear with me. It does mean I'd be less polished than some of the other presentations you give, but I'll do my best. Why is there so much messing around? Why is there so much harm on the internet, and what type of harm does it take? Those are two questions I'm going to try to answer. So if I did have a slide, I would pin up a elderly, very dapperly dressed older man, who some of you would identify as Dr. Vinton Cerf. So godfather of the internet, author of the TCP/IP protocol, so absolutely foundational stuff. And in 2019, he gave an absolutely fascinating interview. And he said when he was writing this, did he think he was building the foundations of modern society? No, he didn't. He was a geek doing something really interesting that had huge potential. He knew that. Did he think it would actually change, revolutionize communications and so quickly in a way that all of us would become so dependent on it? No, he didn't. And that's his words, not mine. So when he was doing that, did he think long and hard about who might cheat, who would take, as with any revolutionary innovation throughout centuries, millennia of human history, did he think that people would, did he think, well, I'm designing this, so I need to really think about how to safeguard it? No, he didn't. So in other words, wrote this protocol and did a whole bunch of other things and communicated with all the other people who built this wonderful, weird, slightly chaotic innovation, and they didn't secure it, and they didn't really think about it. In fact, the whole model, the whole incentives, not least because it came out of things like universities and so forth, and the elements of the military that liked connectivity. The whole incentive was around, maximize connectivity. So the internet, as we all know, was built without security in mind. And then all of a sudden we became highly dependent on it. And around the mid-90s, a lot of people started speculating around, well, what's this going to mean for security? In fact, you can even go further back, and I'm looking, sorry, apologies for singling you out, but looking at people of my generation and above, you may remember a 1983 movie. It's tremendous fun for the younger people who haven't watched it yet, called War Games, starring Matthew Broderick, a young Matthew Broderick. And in that movie in 1983, a young Matthew Broderick, who's a sort of computer whiz with some borrowed hardware from his parents, sits in a Chicago suburb, hacks into what he thinks is the local video game store to get more computer games. It turns out to be the Pentagon. He breaks in by accident to a simulated nuclear war game and almost starts World War III. And that is, in my view, the foundation of, accidentally, because I'm not blaming Matthew Broderick and those who made this hugely entertaining film, which is all sorts of interesting insights into cybersecurity, such as weak passwords and lack of resilient systems and so forth. But it is the foundation of apocalyptic cybersecurity, which became the dominant narrative for a generation afterwards, and to some extent still is. I'll come to Ukraine later on. It still is. So in other words, you have a teenager messing around with the computer, almost starting World War III. Now, of course, that's Hollywood. It's a bit ridiculous. But in 1995, again, with the head slides, I would flash up the cover of Time magazine. Big thing saying cyber war. And the cover image is an American soldier with effectively a computer on his head. And this was the future of war. It was going to be people wandering around, sort of, thinking things and pressing buttons rather than fighting in combat. You go to 2010, there's a cover of The Economist, the venerable British magazine that everybody in the University of Oxford more or less has to read. It kind of goes with the job description. And it's got a big picture of a sort of, skyline, a rich city skyline with tower blocks and skyscrapers and so forth. And they're all coming down a la 9/11, and it says cyber war, the future of online conflict and so forth. So we have this catastrophization of cybersecurity. And it turns out you're all highly intelligent IT professionals. We all sort of follow the news and so forth. It will have not escaped to your notice that none of that has actually happened. That's the wrong problem that we've been chasing. So what sort of things have happened? What is the nature of digital pollution? And my contention, and I think there's a huge amount of evidence to support this, is that cyber harms, digital pollution is much more like pollution than it is like war. It is chronic rather than catastrophic. It's pernicious rather than sudden. It's confidence sapping. It's about intimidation. It's about theft. It's about harassment. It's about annoyance and inconvenience. It's about just making the overheads of life higher in ways that just really, often in individual terms, don't amount to a hill of beans. If you're the Prime Minister, you think, well, there's a lot going on, so I'm not that bothered that some company in Gloucester has just been done over. But when you've got hundreds and thousands of these things, and you've got an economy that's trying to bet on tech to have a sustainable and prosperous future, it ends up being really, really quite serious. So you look at the type of harms that we've got. We've basically got three types, I call them: getting robbed, getting weakened, and getting hurt. So getting robbed is a whole bunch of things. There's an awful lot of just pure theft on the internet. Probably everybody knows somebody who's lost a small amount, potentially a significant amount of money through an online scam or through a skimming of a bank account or something like that. Alternatively, the US Department of Justice has called North Korea the world's first state-sponsored cyber criminal. North Korea is desperate for hard currency because of sanctions. So it's taken to setting up, it employs people in uniformed military environments to go and try and steal online. And in 2015, they had a go, many of you will know the SWIFT interbank clearance system. As you might imagine, it's one of the most secure systems in the world, because it really ought to be, but it's got 11,000 endpoints where it connects to 11,000 institutions. And those endpoints are only as strong as people at the other end. And it turned out that Bank of Bangladesh's connection wasn't particularly secure. So off they go, they have a go at it. They have a go at the Bank of Sierra Leone. A few weeks later, it doesn't work, but the Bank of Bangladesh one does work. And they start diverting $81 million. And they would have got apparently $850 million, except that some eagle-eyed regulators in the Federal Reserve in New York noticed this and went, hang on, let's put a stop to that, and brought it to a temporary close. Interestingly, and we'll come to this a bit later, a few weeks later, after their failed attempt in the Bank of Sierra Leone, they have another go at another bank in Asia. They do it so badly that they release, and I will use a virus analogy rather than a pollutant, they release a virus known as WannaCry into the wild. It's so awful that it rampages through the world, getting pretty much every badly defended network except its target in 100 different countries. And in my single worst day in office, in the middle of a general election campaign on a weekend, attacking the National Health Service in this country, it causes serious disruption to that. So you've got a bunch of theft. You've got a bunch of IP theft. You have valuable commercial technology that criminals and nation states are walking off with. You've got a bunch of data theft. You've got, data, as we all know, is a commodity. We debate data storage, data laws at great length. And just as it's a legitimate, if controversial, source of modern wealth, it is also an illicit source of modern wealth. People steal it all the time. So that's the sort of getting robbed aspect of it. We then have strategically getting weakened. So again, in 2015, the Obama administration publicly acknowledges that it believes that and this is one of the beginnings of the sort of deterioration in US-China relations, that it believes that the Chinese state has stolen a copy of the database of something called the Office of Personnel Management. And if you know the US government system well, the Office of Personnel Management is basically the civil service department. And if you've ever worked or know anybody who has worked in a government who has filled in the government security clearance form, you will know that this is not really the sort of details that you give to, let's take another data heist, let's say Ticketmaster. I'm a Ticketmaster customer. So when I was head of the National Cybersecurity Centre and somebody did Ticketmaster and stole their customer list, I was on it. I'm not particularly embarrassed about it, nor did I feel particularly threatened by it, because all they had was my email address, the last 4 digits of my bank card, and a password that I wasn't using anywhere else. If they had stolen my security clearance form, that would have been quite a different matter, because it is absolutely everything about you if you do an advanced government security clearance form. All your finances, all your family, previous relationships, the works, everything. And the Obama administration conceded that the Chinese state had walked off with the records of pretty much everybody who'd filled in one of those forms in the first 14 years of the century. 21.5 million Americans, population level compromise, secondary security identifiers like mother's birth name and all of that, no longer any use to those people for the rest of their lives. An extraordinary strategic damage for the US. You look at things like political interference. In the US midterms last month, given that it's now the 1st of December, there were still, it wasn't that much, but there were still people arguing about the extent or otherwise of Russian interference in 2016. And you can say what you like about whether you believe, whether the so-called Gucci for 2.0 hacks decisively swung the 2016 election for Donald Trump, but the fact that people were still arguing about it 6 weeks later is a victory for the Russian hackers, because it destabilizes the body politic. So you can see that sort of pernicious harm. You see the sort of fear when you go, as we used to do when I was at GCHQ, you used to go to a critical national infrastructure company and say, we found this little implant somewhere. It's trying not to be detected. The victim organization would go, well, what's it doing there? So, well, we don't know. We can't ask it. It's a piece of code. We can't ask you to put it there because they're in Russia or China or wherever they are. So you can see this way in which you're strategically weakened, but not sort of fatally sort of compromised. But you do get to getting hurt. You get to those answers. You get to the situations like the NHS one I talked about. Even worse was when, between the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of February 2022, Ukraine became known in some areas of cybersecurity scholarship as sort of Russia's cyber playground, where Russia was continually harassing and intimidating Ukraine. But occasionally, on one occasion spectacularly, that would go further than Ukraine's borders. So just after the North Korean attack that hit the British NHS, 6 weeks later, the Russians had another go at the Ukrainian economy. They went for a tax software firm, and they did it really badly. It was called the NotPetya virus. I won't go into the technical details, but if the Russians, like the North Koreans, had been better at their job, it would have been much less damaging. Instead, they had a go at this Ukrainian tax software organization. It goes all over the world. It hits Maersk, the shipping giant. The next thing you know, 20% of the world's merchant shipping fleet is being controlled by WhatsApp. And just to show that this wasn't a targeted attack, my favorite example of the consequences of this was that it stopped production at Cadbury's chocolate factory in Tasmania off the coast of Australia. So you can see this sort of, it's destructive in the sense that it stops things happening, not in the sense that it kills people. I'll come on to that in a bit. But you can see the sorts of harm here. Then you've got the sort of phenomenon of damaging ransomware, where instead of stealing data, you lock people out and you say, I'm going to charge you $4 million in Bitcoin to get back in. And you see some really serious harms through this because you ransom. I mean, in America, every year, more than 100 hospitals get hit by ransomware. That doesn't mean operating theaters stop working in mid-operation. It means that ambulances don't get received. It means that operations get cancelled because people can't organize them and so forth. So you get to that more destructive, getting hurt aspect of things. So that's why I think, rather than this apocalyptic version, cyber harms, digital pollution, are more pernicious. They tend not to kill people. There's a I wouldn't say the reason for that is a technical one, because that would be insulting to an expert audience. But I would say that one of the misunderstandings of cyber harms is that we tend to sort of characterize cyber attacks as if cyber capabilities were weapons. And I think they're not weapons in that sense. So if you take, there's a famous exchange in my sort of field of work. There's a famous exchange between the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the chairman of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, almost exactly a year ago, as tensions were mounting around Ukraine and people were beginning to think that Russian invasion might be imminent. And Ellwood was challenging Johnson about reductions in the conventional army. And the then Prime Minister's response was that we've got to, he said infamously, he said the age of big tank battles on the European landmass are over. He was obviously a little bit premature about that. But he then said we've got to be investing in the capabilities of the future, like high-tech weaponry and cyber. And high-tech weaponry and cyber are two different things. So a rock is a low-tech weapon. It's probably the oldest, most lowest tech weapon that our species knows. You pick up a rock, you throw it at somebody, it hurts and possibly kills them. A high-tech weapon is basically a high-tech rock. In terms of it hits something and it blows it up. That if it's an inanimate object, it destroys it. If it's a living object, it hurts and possibly kills it. Cyber is a piece of code. It depends what happens at the other end. So if you think about an air traffic control system, have you ever been on a plane where if the computer system failed, accidentally or maliciously, the plane would fall out of the sky as a result? Would you get on a plane if you thought that was going to happen? Or would there be a backup system that allows you to land the plane safely? Similarly, a railway system, if two trains are going at high speed towards each other and the signals get hacked, what would happen? Would the trains crash into each other, causing mass fatalities? Or would they stop at the signals that weren't working, causing mass inconvenience and disruption? And it should be always and everywhere the latter, otherwise it's a failure of safety. It's not a failure of cybersecurity, it's a failure of the safety system. So cyber is an indirect harm. It's a big harm, and it's pernicious, and in aggregate it's terrible. But actually, as far as I know, certainly in terms of major, advanced, rich Western economies, whatever you want to call them, the number of people officially killed by cyber attacks is zero. There was a case in Germany in 2020 where an elderly woman was being transported to hospital in an ambulance. The ambulance was phoned by the hospital, the destination hospital, said, "We've suffered a cyber attack. It was a ransomware attack. You can't bring anybody to this hospital." The ambulance was diverted to a hospital further away, and sadly the patient died on the way. The German authorities tried to prosecute this case for negligent homicide. The patient was so ill already that they couldn't do that to criminal standards. And that's the closest to my knowledge that any state has come to saying anybody's been killed by cyber attack. But an awful lot of social and economic damage has been done instead, as I'll come to a bit later. So that is, if you like, that's where digital pollution leaves us. It's a bit like real pollution in the physical environment. You can possibly ascribe some terrible things to it, but you're not sure, but you know that it's making your everyday life a bit more unpleasant, and over time it's probably going to make it very unpleasant. So what do we do about this? What do we do about this sort of thing? And this brings me to the sort of subject of public policy and cybersecurity and what we did at the National Cybersecurity Centre. So again, I'm going to go back to the sort of period 2013, 2014 when I started in this. And we were just beginning to wise up to this narrative. We've been, partly to get awareness, US senior defense officials, defense secretaries, CIA chiefs, Pentagon chiefs have been talking about, and these are their phrases, not mine, cyber Pearl Harbors, cyber 9/11. Beginning to think, actually, I'm not sure we should be using this rhetoric because it's the wrong problem. And I remember I was given my first speech, prepared by my team, my first ever public speech on cybersecurity, and the first ever public speech by a senior GCHQ person on the subject. And it was called Cyber Realism, and it was exactly the sort of narrative I've been giving you for the last 20 minutes. Let's understand cyber harms. They're not apocalyptic, actually, they're quite boring, but they're really damaging in aggregate and so on. And that was going to be my theme. And they said, "Oh, before you go out on stage, we're going to play a video." I was watching the video off stage. It was a bit like a bright sort of light like this, and all of a sudden it went dark. And then all of a sudden it was a city in flames with people rioting and looting because there'd been an apocalyptic cyber attack, and it was sort of Mad Max mixed with Lord of the Flies, and civilization had been, been brought to a halt. So my speech on cyber realism was somewhat incompatible with the preceding video, but things got a bit better from then. I remember being at a conference in Georgetown University in Washington, and a guy called Art Coviello, who had just stepped down as being sort of transformational chief executive of the cybersecurity giant RSA. He gave a speech where he was saying that we've had two cybersecurity strategies under President George W. Bush, two under President Barack Obama. UK had two, one under Gordon Brown, one under the Cameron coalition. And they all said, look, the answer is what we've got to do is share information and get the public and private sector working together. And that's what I've been told the answer was. And also we needed elite organizations like GCHQ and the National Security Agency in the United States to take care of the top end of the problem. The challenge was, we've been saying this stuff for well over half a decade and it wasn't really working. Now, I thought it was a brilliant analysis from Coviello. Where I differed with him was that he said, well, so we need to do information sharing and public-private partnerships properly. I was sort of thinking, well, if the US government has tried it 4 times and it's not worked, and the British government has tried it twice and it's not worked, maybe we should try and do something else. So we went back. I remember talking about this with the technical experts, and they were like, yes, we really, we've been hoping that people would start to take an interest in different ways of thinking. And so we tried to look at why was there so much, in effect, digital pollution? And there were all sorts of reasons for this. Lack of information from the government was one of them, but a whole bunch of things around economics and behavioral science that weren't really technical, but we could do things to fix them. So if you are worried about cyber security in your organization, and you thought, well, I want to know how to detect threats to my organization. That's a perfectly responsible thing to do. So I need some threat intelligence. So I'm going to buy some threat intelligence. So a whole bunch of companies grew up that became really, really good at commercial threat intelligence. So the market economy worked absolutely fine in threat intelligence. Great companies like CrowdStrike and Mandiant and all these other, in my field, household names, it started to grow up. No need for government intervention. Maybe there are things that CrowdStrike aren't allowed to do, so the government does them and manage it discreetly at the very top end of the threat. Broadly speaking, threat intelligence worked. You then move to another part of the problem. So most, not all, but the vast majority of cyber operations basically are about impersonation of another individual or another corporate brand of some kind. So in order to get into your network, I'm going to send you something. It could be an email, it could be an attachment, it could be something else. But I'm going to send you something that convinces you that I'm something that I'm not really, and then I'm going to take over the controls. So spoofing of identity of brands was one of the biggest digital pollutants. The problem was, turns out, nobody had an incentive to fix it. So we initially worked this out with government. We looked at, because GCHQ, global intelligence superpower, had loads of data on who was being impersonated, who was being spoofed the most. And in the UK, the most spoofed brand was Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, because it was a brilliant thing to spoof, right? Really easy, because everyone, oh, HMRC. And the best way, the most common way of spoofing the most commonly spoofed brand was not to tell you that you were, as those phone calls do, that you were in breach. It was actually to offer you a refund. So you get all sorts of things saying, blah, 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 from at hmrc-gov.com or something like that. But, it looked pretty good and so forth. You know, all these things. And you'd be offered a tax refund. We started working with HMRC on this, and we said, have you done any analysis on the implications of this for the tax take? And they said, actually, we've done a bit. It has no impact at all. Because if you get a scam email from HMRC, if you're a tax dodger, you're still going to dodge tax. And if you're a law-abiding taxpayer, you're going to pay your tax. You might be slightly annoyed you've got this phishing email, but it's not going to affect your dealings with HMRC. So we then went to the retailers in the private sector. We said, okay, so Tesco's and Sainsbury's were quite spoofed brands, not quite as spoofed as often as HMRC, but they were spoofed quite a lot. Said, does this affect your sales? And they said, as far as we can tell, no. Because if somebody's loyal to Tesco's or Sainsbury's and they get a spoof email from somebody pretending to be Tesco's or Sainsbury's, quite rationally, they don't blame Tesco's or Sainsbury's. So unlike threat intelligence, where it's like, okay, company is vulnerable, therefore society is vulnerable, market fixes it by providing some threat intelligence they can use to stop attacks. Here you have society is vulnerable because of spoof brand, company not incentivized to care. So you start thinking about stuff like that. So what we did was there's this thing called the DMARC protocol, domain name authentication, and it's quite simple. It makes it harder. It's not foolproof, but it makes it much harder to spoof a brand. And we did the pilot with HMRC because they're part of government. We knew them well, no commercial advantage to anybody, etc., etc. And the way we configured it was, and this is in 2016-17, the way we configured it was essentially writing protocols and say, dear internet, if this looks like this, pretending to be from HMRC, don't deliver it. And not just don't deliver it to us so we can analyze it. And in the first full year of doing this pilot, we collected 500 million attempts to spoof HMRC. Now, this is really interesting. For a start, those 500 million, where they came from, what they looked like, etc., were really, really good for giving defense and so forth. But the other thing was, there's this nonsense in cybersecurity that people are the weakest link and so forth. Well, people are getting tons of these things. And let's say you work on vaccine research at the University of Oxford in 2020. You've got quite an important job and you're quite intelligent and you're very, very important. And you get a whole bunch of emails and you're busy and so forth. Are you competent? You're very competent in vaccine research. Are you competent to work out whether you think an email is spoof or not? B, even if you are, do all of us, the rest of us, want a vaccine researcher at this university in the summer of 2020 spending all day hovering over URLs, working out whether or not they can trust them, or do we want them to get on with developing a vaccine? We want to do the latter. So the beauty of this is that a bit of government intervention, because we mandated this on all government websites and then promoted it onto amongst commercial sectors, said, look, use this, it's free, it's quite easy, etc., etc. On the HMRC example, that's 500 million occasions in 2017 where something didn't land in somebody's inbox, where they had to say, oh, I've got an email, do I trust it? So there are these little interventions that you could make. We did similar things with hosting, with malicious website hosting. We found at GCHQ for years that if you went to a website host and said, look, we find some absolute malicious garbage on this website you're hosting, and say, oh God, I'm really sorry, we'll take it down, because most people act in good faith, and when they're presented with credible information from an appropriate authority, they'll do the right thing. But going to, at the scale of digital pollution, going to all these different organizations, with piecemeal one-on-one information wasn't scalable. So a little company called Netcraft in Bath, they've been around for about 20 years, paid them about 5 million quid, and they automated a way of sending out these requests, not verified by us, showing the sort of technical information and asking people to take it down. And within a year of launching that, the average time that a website hosting malicious code in the UK was up fell from 26 hours to 45 minutes. And the UK's share of this digital pollution went from 5.5% of the global share that we could see to 2%. So we started to do things like that. We started to advise people that they didn't need to be nation state cyber warriors. They needed to do sensible things. They needed to do multi-factor authentication. They needed to have sensible password policy that could work for them. We started the move towards revoking 20 years of password guidance, because password guidance was your classic cybersecurity producer capture situation where, let's say I have a network and you want on my network. So I say, right, to get on my network, you're going to have an 18-character password with uppercase, lowercase numbers and special characteristics. And I'm going to make you change it every 30 days. And when you go on his network, you better use a different 18-digit one. According to behavioral scientific research, nothing to do with technical cybersecurity, if you do that for the average Brit, it was the equivalent of asking them to remember a new 600-digit number every month. So we're asking people to do the impossible. We were making cybersecurity impossible. And there's an element of cybersecurity, which I'll come on to, which is basically Darwinian. It is the classic, you don't need to outrun the lion, you just need to outrun the other person who's being attacked. So we were just making things too complicated, too hard. We weren't making these simple interventions. At the same time, we were fantasizing about cyber apocalypses that were never really going to happen. So we made some progress, tried to give sensible advice, tried to manage incidents better and communicate clearly so that people didn't panic and so forth. But the mantra, and we can go into this in questions, the mantra was take away as much of the harm from as many of the people as often as you can, rather than try and do the sort of heroic cyber stuff. So that takes us into this decade, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about some before I sort of finish, I want to take a little bit about some sort of trends and where all this leaves us now. So I left government midway through the sort of first wave of the pandemic. I was supposed to go and have a nice break traveling the world in the summer of 2020, but for reasons that are beyond the control of anybody in this room, that didn't happen. And I think instead, we have seen a number of quite interesting trends in cybersecurity that are worth sort of reflecting. So I'll take briefly the 3 years of this decade so far in turn and tell us what I think this has left, where this has left us in cybersecurity and what this now means for the future. So 2020 was all about the pandemic. And I remember thinking, at the start of lockdown, what all this was going to mean. And I would say that there were three things that I remember from the pandemic from the cybersecurity point of view. And the first is overwhelmingly positive. So if you told me that in the course of a few days in the middle of March 2020, the entire country, and indeed most similar countries, we're going to have a massive, unplanned, national scale experiment with moving to home working quickly. And what would that mean for cybersecurity? I said it'll probably be an absolute disaster. It's not the sort of thing that you just think it's going to be fine. You abandon most things, your risk appetite changes totally. When people were saying we've got to work from home, we don't have that much remote IT, but we've got some old stuff down the back of the cupboard, some old phones and so forth. Should we use it? We have to, etc. Actually, cybersecurity worked reasonably well. IT sort of held up. So that was sort of good news. The second thing, however, was that it exposed some absolutely rampant criminality. It was always there, it was always visible, but you could see it. So net cybercrime in that period, as far as we can measure accurately, which is really hard for reasons you can probably imagine, net cybercrime is actually probably quite stable. That's partly because things like there were parts of India, for example, that hosted a lot of cybercrime, but the cybercrime that hosted was kind of the organizations, we knew them quite well from police work and intelligence work and so forth. They were actually quite in-person affairs. They were in big warehouses where people would turn up. And when lockdown happened, that part of cybercrime fell away. But other cybercrime operators had a field day scamming fake PPE offers, fake COVID cures, fake COVID tests, fake government assistance schemes, and so forth. So you can see just the sheer amoral viciousness of global cybercrime. You also saw the just sheer geopolitical contest that is cybercrime. So I'm going to come back to our researchers at the University of Oxford. You think about the sort of building we're in, you just think of the architecture, the physical and digital of this city and this university. Lots of brilliant people trying to connect and communicate with each other, but not a big centralized network. So therefore, not huge amounts of cybersecurity effort and so forth. And for most of the time, that's kind of fine. Then all of a sudden, the Jenner Institute and a few other parts of this university become some of the biggest intelligence targets in the world. And you have to think about, well, how do you protect? You have this vision of critical infrastructure, the energy grids, the power plants, the banks, and so forth. But actually what's critically strategically important to a country at any given point in time changes all the time. And all of a sudden vaccine research became critically important. So you have to try and surge onto protecting that. There's no way that the university or the small parts of the university doing that can be expected to do that on their own. They need government help. The government works with them. But of course, what the nation does not need is for the government's cybersecurity people to come in and say, right, you need to close this down, close that down, and so forth, because you need the people to work at pace in collaboration with others. So you end up having to be very flexible and nimble. What that also then shows you is basically the two sources of cyber harm. So when we started worrying about cybersecurity, one of the sort of big apocalyptic cybergeddon type of scenarios was cyber terrorism. And you can understand why people are worried about cyber terrorism. If somebody's prepared to kill themselves in the course of killing others and do really horrific things, if they're able to do it by computer, they will do it. Actually, cyber terrorism has never taken off. And that's because anybody can be a little bit of a hacker. You can steal some money, you can spoof some passwords and your mess and intimidate and so forth. But to do very sophisticated state-of-the-art operations that could really damage things, take out air traffic control systems, even though they have backups and so on, is really, really hard. And it takes time, money, skills, infrastructure, it takes stability that terrorist groups don't have. But there are two groups that do have that stability. One is nation states, and they're the sorts of people who will target vaccine research because it's strategically advantageous to them. And they will be targeted, and they'll be patient, and they will employ very skilled people, and they will really go for you, and that makes it very hard to defend against. And then there are criminals, and that's where the Darwinian aspect of this comes in. And if I look back self-critically at my own career, I think that in terms of harm caused to real people most of the time, we probably correctly assess the nation state threat, the IP theft that people worry about from the People's Republic of China, the strategic sort of interference with elections from Russia, some of the Iranian retaliation and spying, North Korean cash theft that I spoke about. But we completely underestimated just how damaging venal, horrible cybercrime could be. And that takes me from 2020 to 2021, because 2021 was a disastrous year for cybersecurity in the West, not because I left, but because of what a bunch of things that happened, mostly out of Russia, but not really connected to the Russian state. So Russia provides, Russia has a long, this is nothing to do with the Ukraine invasion, Russia has a long-standing complicated relationship with serious crime, and serious crime has gone online and gone digital. And so there are people there who, if they were in the UK or the US or anywhere in certainly most parts of the EU, if they were operating the way they're operating in Russia, they're so visible they couldn't be hidden. They'd be arrested and the operation would be shut down. The Russian state allows them to operate. And what's unique about cybercrime is that for the first time in human history, you can do large-scale, consistent and sustained damage to another country and another society without you or an accomplice ever setting foot in it. If you take international terrorism, you do all the plotting abroad, you can do all the conspiring abroad and so forth, but at the end of the operation, somebody somewhere has to set foot on the territory of the target and do something, and at that point they can be interdicted and arrested and disrupted and so forth. And cybercrime can sit and do the whole thing remotely, and that's what's happening. So you have this outbreak of ransomware, really dangerous ransomware. You had the hacking of a pipeline in the United States, Colonial Pipeline, which services nearly half of the East Coast's petrol station gasoline sort of supplies. And Russian criminals hacked it, asked for $4.4 million in Bitcoin. It got paid. And the interesting thing about that was they hacked the ordinary emails and the ordinary enterprise IT, not the operational IT of the pipeline, but they messed up the company's ability to run the pipeline so badly, invoicing, safety rosters, all that stuff, that the company shut down the pipeline and caused a major fuel shortage. And there are pictures of people pouring petrol at gas stations into plastic bags because there's a fuel shortage, and the Biden administration ended up giving, and I'm not making this up, giving advice to people not to fill plastic bags full of petrol. 63% of the gas stations in the state of South Carolina briefly ran out of oil, etc., etc. The worst case was Ireland, where there's a body called the Health Services Executive. Think of the NHS commissioning. It commissions all the sort of healthcare provision from primary care providers, which are a mixture of public, private, and voluntary, and it got done over. And the next thing you know, cancer consultations are being postponed for a month, 2 months, and so forth. Antenatal services are being restricted to women who are either in the advanced stages of pregnancy or already know medical difficulty. You know, at some point, somebody will quantify, because that has done harm. That has done real harm to people's physical sort of outcome, health outcomes. And you think about, you know, people are saying, well, this comes from Russia, it must be from the Kremlin. I mean, there's no way in the summer of 2021 that Putin's Kremlin was going to order a hit on the Irish Health Service. It doesn't make any sense. It is, you know, it is organized criminality of the sort of worst kind. Then you get to the war, and I want to take you back to February, where February of this year, where you look at the British media, you look at, you know, the warnings and so forth. We were very scared of Russian retaliation as a result of our sort of our sanctions and so forth. We were worried that that soft underbelly that had been exposed by the Russian-based ransomware hackers, because in 2021, 74% of the paid ransoms that could be traced openly had gone to entities in the Russian Federation. We were worried that Putin would use the same sort of tactics against us. For a variety of reasons, he hasn't. Probably he doesn't want to provoke the West, probably because he envisaged a quick military victory. But that point, I think, in time was very interesting, because the West, I think, realized its own vulnerability. It also worried about the extent to which Russia would use sort of cyber firepower in support of its murderous aims against Ukraine itself. The cyber contest in Ukraine has been intense. It's been secondary to the barbarity on the battlefield waged by the Russians. And I think it shows again that actually, in some respects, cyber is more useful to an aggressor in peacetime or times of tension than it is in wartime. You know, as General Sir Patrick Sanders, the head of the British Army, has said, you know, what this shows you is you can't cyber your way up a river. You can't hold ground with cyber and so on. You can intimidate, harass, steal, and so on, but you can't just, you know, you can't seize a country by computer, but you can intimidate one. So we're back to this point, and you talk about intimidating a society. Actually, you know, for all the talk of sort of cyber apocalypse and so on, you know, Ukraine has managed heroically to defend its networks, just as heroically as defending its own sort of land and so on. But it has the whole war has shown the limitations of cyber as a tool of very aggressive sort of prosecution. But then when you think back to the vulnerabilities, in the last couple of months, the previously sort of quiet cybersecurity landscape of Australia has been transformed again by criminal data breaches. So if you think that, you know, lest we think that the situation in Ukraine shows us that, you know, cyber vulnerabilities can be less damaging to society than perhaps we feared. Yes, in terms of all-out conquest, but in terms of non-combatant countries trying to live peacefully. At the moment, in the recent past, large sections of the Australian population have been destabilized and scared by another criminal breach, which they blamed on criminals acting out of Russia under the safe harbor of the Russian state, where in a number of high-profile operations, the most damaging one has been the theft of the medical records of 9.7 million Australians, a very significant proportion of the Australian population, from the country's main medical insurer. The hackers demanded payment in exchange for a guarantee, such as what they could be given, not to publish this information. The company, the insurer, refused, and the next thing you know, files marked abortions, mental health problems, alcohol problems are appearing on the dark web. This is a really, really pernicious set of problems, and that point about data security is one of the oldest problems in cyber. So we can talk about, you know, maintaining critical systems and so forth. We're still in a situation where major Western economies are not protecting basic but sensitive data sets of our own population. We still haven't got there in terms of countering digital pollution, and it's that rather than the catastrophic risk that we need to come to terms with. So to finish, where is the optimism? What do we do about all of this? What is our digital hygiene? Let me just say 3 points. One is about the basics. One is about competing models of technology, and the other is about changing technology. So let's start with the basics. And this goes back to Dr. Vinton Cerf and his, look, when I wrote all this and built all this, I wasn't thinking about security. So that leaves us with a legacy that we can only mitigate, we can't transform. But at the same time, my former US opposite number, a guy called Chris Krebs, a heroic guy, he was fired by Donald Trump in his dying days of his presidency because he'd protected the 2020 election from outside interference rather too well. And he'd said it was the fairest election in American history, so Trump fired him as a result of saying that. So Chris is this thing where he says, you know, he's not a cybersecurity consultant, and all these organizations hire him because of his, you know, deserved global fame for standing up to Trump. And we say, like, we're really worried about this. We need a new cybersecurity strategy. He says, you don't need a new cybersecurity strategy. We need Windows 10. Windows 10 would have taken care of so much of this sort of problem. There's so much, and so if the Irish healthcare thing, if they'd been using a more up-to-date set of software, it wouldn't have happened. There are so many things for the basics. You know, again, you can't transform it. There are holes there. There are things you cannot defend against because of the way it's built. But at the same time, you know, Windows 10 as a proxy for just keeping things up to date and using the best practice is really, really important. So that's the first thing. The second thing is a bit more challenging. So cybersecurity is a lot more complicated than it used to be, not because of computer network security, but because it's gone beyond computer network security. So, you know, something for another lecture where I will go on for slightly less than an hour, I promise, is the whole thing around the US-China contest for the future of the internet. Now, I'm not going to go into the geopolitics and the morality of that, other than to say, you know, the idea of technology as a single global whole is now gone. It's gone. And you can view that as a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a fact. And what that now means is that where things come from, who builds them, and so forth, whether they're from, you know, what the West would say is its free and open model versus the more authoritarian model, sort of matters an awful lot in terms of security. So cybersecurity no longer just means, you know, is your network free of digital pollutants? It means, do you have a sustainable industrial base for building it? Is it going to be better performing than its competitor model? You know, we're physically in the West. We're in a country that's aligned with the US and sees China as a strategic threat and competitor. You know, is it going to outcompete that other model? And that requires a whole new way of thinking. You know, if the big controversy that dominated the last year or so of my service before the pandemic, 5G and whether Huawei would play a part in it, was all about that. But at the root of the Huawei issue was the fact that Western-based telecoms infrastructure manufacturing had basically collapsed into a tiny number of companies. And there was a new sort of tech model coming from China that competed with the West. Russia doesn't compete with the West in tech. Russia cheats on the internet that America built. So does China, but China has built its own internet in a way that Russia hasn't. And there now is this, we can talk about this afterwards if you like, but there now is a sort of battle for the struggle of the internet. And from a Western perspective, what that means, and this is my last point, I promise, because well, far longer than I should have, even longer than they asked me to. The final point is that what matters to us, if we're going to have prosperity, if we're going to keep, maintain and enhance the sort of free and open societies that we want in the digital age, we're going to have to maintain confidence in our digital environment. But here's where the hope comes in. Tech's changing, and it's changing for the better from a security point of view. And we now know that we cannot let a new generation of technology come into being like the old one without security in mind. So if you take IoT, look back, we could all Google this 6, 7, 8 years ago. IoT's on its way, says newspaper article. That means instead of 5 billion internet connected devices by 2022, there are going to be 30 billion connected devices. So there's going to be 6 times as much risk. It's 2022 now. There are about 30 billion internet connected devices in the world. It's not 6 times worse than it was. In fact, it's probably better because IoT is actually quite good for security. You can hold it, you can inspect its hardware, you pay for a product or for a service. You pay somebody and you can regulate that. You can provide information about who's more secure. It's completely different from the old model where I want to get something without paying any money. So I'm going to go on a website and give away loads of personal data. That was the old economic model. It's still with us. It's terrible for security. IoT, you've got governments saying, look, you can't sell stuff that you can't change the default password from password anymore. That's now law in Britain. It's law in Singapore. It's law in the European Union. You know, quantum computing, as and when it comes in, let's make sure that it comes in a way that's managed where there's quantum resistant cryptography. I'm delighted there aren't a whole bunch of driverless cars driving around outside on the streets, not because the technology is not there, we've all seen it on TV, but because we haven't yet found a way of doing it safely and economically. At the minute, none of us want to get into a car where the only thing stopping us crashing into another car is the maintenance of a mobile phone signal. So we're holding off on its implementation. These are the correct things to do. We're going to get it right this time because as technology changes, we're going to change our security with it. That is because I think, even if people aren't really using the language, we are beginning to think of cyberspace as an environment. We are beginning to think of cyber harms as pollutants, and we are beginning to think in the same way as we're trying successfully and unsuccessfully at the same time. We're not going to get everything right. We're trying in the physical environment to clean things up. We're trying to do things in the digital environment as well. Sorry to go on for so long. Thank you for listening. I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Ciaran. That's an absolutely fascinating talk, and I know that you agreed to take some questions. We've already got a few coming in online, and I'm going to take the first question from online, and then sort of move around between online and the audience. So the first question then is, why are there no public information broadcasts on basic computer hygiene for individuals?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, I mean, it depends what you mean by public information broadcast. So, you know, why isn't there sort of 5 minutes, 1950 style clip telling you not to, you know, put your head in the washing machine or drive after having 5 pints? Because, you know, I suppose, and here's a plug for my old organization, and I'm not selling anything, but you take some things for granted. ncsc.gov.uk 7 years ago was unthinkable. The government didn't do very much. It had one little brochure called 10 Steps to Cybersecurity, and I've got literally hundreds of things on it. I do, you know, and also I remember thinking, you know, as a civil servant, you like to try and find ways when you have impact. I remember when I was looking at secondary schools for my daughter, who's now 13, but when, you know, it was 10, you were thinking, well, you've gone around the various schools, and there was the sort of, here's what you should do for your password, and it was the NCSC, you know, it was on the wall of the school. So I think there are things. However, I would accept they haven't hit the public consciousness as much. I think that's partly a legacy of Cybergeddon, the Cybergeddon sort of myth. And the Cybergeddon myth is really damaging because A, it's the wrong problem. And if you're chasing the wrong problem, you're doing the wrong thing. But B, it infantilizes people. It makes people, you know, if the risk you're worried about is, you know, tower blocks being blown up by computer, then ordinary people, and we're all ordinary people think, well, I mean, you know, I don't want that to happen, but there's nothing I can do about it. You know, that's for the government to worry, that's for the military, that's for the intelligence services to worry about, nothing to do with me. Actually, all this stuff has everything to do with you. So I suppose in conclusion, I wouldn't quite accept the premise. I think there's plenty of public information out there. We've got to get past this guff about, we're all going to be blown up, and because that infantilizes and quite stuff we can do.
Yes, I mean, I must admit it's fantastic to hear somebody talking about trying to get the military language out of the discussion of security, because I found that intensely irritating.
And damaging.
And damaging, yes. Always to be talking about things like attack surfaces and so on. This is not the sort of language that's helpful to be using it.
Yeah, and there was a point, sorry to digress, but there's a point I didn't make in the talk. I said I would, and then I didn't. But it's about, it's two things really. One is about the primacy of digital as a good thing. I remember when the government did its last cyber strategy as a subset of its security strategy in 2021, I remember a senior journalist, I won't say who it was, saying to me, when this government talk about the internet, it makes it sound like a war zone, and we've got to remember that primarily this is an economic and social phenomenon that's broadly speaking a good thing. The second thing, this is the thing I said I would talk about, but didn't. The thing I learned, and again we got this wrong, was and I wasted my first year in part in the cybersecurity job at GCHQ fighting with the government digital service. The government digital service, you may remember them, they were brilliant. They were world leading at the time. Britain was #1 in the world for digital government about 8 to 10 years ago. And we were saying to them, using commercial technology for government services is very risky. You should we need to lock this down, lock that down, and so forth. And eventually they ignored us. Really interesting. If you look at the 2011 National Cybersecurity Strategy, it says literally nothing about the security of government, because they said we're not letting you because you'll just slow down the digital revolution. Eventually, sadly, there's a great woman called Alison Whitney who sadly died a few weeks ago, which is why I'm thinking about this a lot. She convinced me and a bunch of others. She said, look, the government digital service have got it right. They're saying, think of the citizen, think of the ordinary user, and think about how to make digital interaction with the government as easy. What GDS were doing, their whole mantra was make digital interaction with the government as easy as digital interaction with the private sector was becoming. Right? So our job was to make it as easy and safe as it was with the private sector. Not impenetrable, because the easiest way to do that was to stop people interacting digitally with the government. In fact, that was the only way to do it, to make it, if you wanted to make it impenetrable. So we learned to say, well, okay, sadly, there's going to be a bit of digital fraud in the 150 billion social security system. Let's try and minimize it rather than eliminate it. But at the same time, let's try and make it easy for people who need to interact with the government to get money out of it. So some really, really important learning there.
Do we have a question from the audience here?
Hi.
I wanted to ask you if you believe there's an inherent tension perhaps between centralization in the IoT and perhaps decentralization and civil liberties perhaps, and if this could pose a risk to that. Thank you.
Yeah, so here's an example directly from this university. I'm deadly serious about this. So, and then scale it out to society as a whole. So this university, for those of you who know it, is famously, even by the standards of universities, it's famously decentralized. You've got tiny little subsets. And so, over time, a lot of them just introduce their own IT system. And you can tell from scalable security, that's probably a bit rubbish, really. But then you say, okay, we're going to centralize it. And then people say, well, what does that mean? It disempowers individual institutions, but also it means that, well, I'm an academic working on sensitive stuff. Who's running this network that I'm on? What accesses do they have, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always a tension between centralization and liberty and so on. As with all of these things, there are imperfect trade-offs. I'm not a lawyer, but we can all think of reading and following cases in law, whether that's in the British domestic courts, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, about competing rights and trying to strike the right balance between them. And digital security is no different. Where digital security has been different, and again, there's an awful lot of learning here, is making those trade-offs. So in this respect, the Snowden stuff is absolutely critical, because it would, you would be surprised, and I'm not going to, you'd be surprised if someone like me who served on the board of GCHQ would condone the leaking of a mass cache of 1.9 million top secret documents, including incredibly sensitive stuff from all over the world. What I would say, and I think most of my peers would say, is that the UK, US, and allies would have been far better placed to withstand that crisis if they'd said a bit more publicly in advance, long about the sort of intelligence operations they felt they needed to do in the digital age, rather than say absolutely nothing about them, because it just allowed people to set a narrative that was, in our view, technically inaccurate, but plausible enough that it certainly for a significant period of time undermined confidence. And yes, there were highly intrusive powers. Yes, there was an awful lot of collection of data. There was not large-scale examination of it. Here with the rules, all of this stuff was subsequently said publicly. We should have done it. We should have done it a bit before. So I think governments and tech companies, frankly, need to treat people like grown-ups and say, look, here's how the digital economy works. It's got all sorts of imperfections. Here's the trade-offs, and so on, and work out how to get to a place that's broadly acceptable to most people.
Thank you. We'll take one from online, from John Lyons, who says that I'm finding that the barriers for those who are elderly or have not had my educational opportunities are being forced to turn to someone they trust to do these things for them. I don't know how many people who should not be trusted have been told people's PIN numbers, etc. But it's the flip side of improved security, so-called. Is anyone looking at if the security versus accessibility trade-off is in the right place?
So, I mean, to a point, yes, people are. So the area I would know best from the previous job was public services, where and it's always hard to talk approvingly of things that didn't happen, but there are certainly decisions that were taken by public services in which we were involved, and in which we would have advised, which had accessibility in mind. So, for example, it would have been possible, if you take online filing of taxes, and we did seriously think about this, it would have been possible to stop people interacting with HMRC using an out-of-date browser. That's possible. And from a cybersecurity point of view, you could see some attractions to that. There is a clear accessibility point to it. So there are times when we think about that. There are times we don't think about it. I think of a number of organizations, both public and private sectors, where the rollout either for staff or customers and citizens of multi-factor authentication has been disastrous, actually, and disastrous from a citizen equity point of view, but actually disastrous from a security point of view, because it doesn't work and people don't do it, and they either stop using the service, which is suboptimal, or they find ways around it, which is worse from a security point of view. So I do accept it's a real challenge. Where I think, again, look, you try and go in the right direction, you get some things right, you get some things wrong. Where I think we're going in the right direction is in this point, which is like, it's got to work for people. If it doesn't work for people, it's not going to work. I do think in that respect, at that high level, we are thinking about this in this country, but we'll be getting a bunch of stuff wrong, or there'll be a bunch of stuff that's been built in for years that we haven't got around to tackling yet.
A question from Hanny. Do you think cybersecurity will ever diminish to a point, well, this is cyber insecurity, will diminish to a point where it ceases to carry much relevance to society in the next 10 to 15 years or any time frame? So is this going to go away, basically?
I talk myself out of the job. I think there's an optimistic scenario where people are a lot less scared of it, and the really optimistic scenario is that you move the interventions further towards the source of technology. So in other words, the stuff that's being built is safer, and therefore people who operate. The people. It's a bit like, I mean, there are times where the analogy between, say, car safety and cybersecurity are really awful and really inappropriate, and the times when they're quite useful. In terms of the specific question, there's an aspect of this where it is quite useful. So you think about car safety over the last century, and despite the explosion in the number of car deaths in this country are actually lower than they were 100 years ago, which is an extraordinary achievement of public policy and industrial security. Fewer people die on Britain's roads now than did. I think it's not quite 100 years ago, but certainly 90 years ago. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. There's public education about driving safety. There's drink driving laws. There's speeding and all of that. But the biggest factor, according to the experts that I've been told about, is the fact that cars are just safer. They're harder to crash, and when they do crash, they withstand the crashes much, much better. The whole thing about the engine doesn't fly through the windscreen and kill people anymore and stuff like that when there's a collision. So your average driver, still needs to have his or her wits about him when they drive, but the vehicle they're driving is so much safer than the vehicle they were driving 100 years ago, and the roads they're driving on are safer than they were 100 years ago. That's where we want to move cybersecurity interventions to. So the driver, the driver, the person doing this, has less and less responsibility. Which is a weird way. We used to sometimes, you talked about public messaging in the first question. There was a bit of a set. You said, we can't say this because it goes against the narrative of empowerment of the citizen. But in cybersecurity, when I was going, we wanted to disempower the citizen, but in a good way. We wanted to give the citizen as little as possible to worry about when they were online, so that they could do whatever it was they came online to do, which wasn't to worry about being secure.
So perhaps a good follow on from that is, again, from John Lyons. If you look at cyberspace as an environment, is the trend to monocultures in cyberspace, for example, Windows 10, and is that as risky as in a real environment?
Yeah, so that's a brilliant question.
Potato light as an example.
Oh, yes, given my accent, that's a good one I'll hit on. Actually, the better one than Windows 10 and the real word about this is cloud. So cloud is a classic of individual versus aggregate incentives not aligning. So, and I'm being completely honest about this, and I know I'm being recorded, so it's been worn down into saying indiscreet things, but when people ask me informally, and I obviously never give this advice in government, people ask me informally, I run a small organization, a charity, whatever, I'm worried about cybersecurity, or indeed, the Romantic School, a government of a smallish country that's not particularly well off and is thinking about digitization. You say, what should you do? And say, oh God, here we go again. And the dilemma is, the obvious thing to do is send them to a cloud giant. Because you look at the cloud giants' cybersecurity budgets and the existential nature of security to them. They spend an absolute fortune on it. They're really, really good at it. And, one of the dynamics that's changed in the NCSC under my leadership was one of the first public authorities in the world to say, people are talking about cloud as a risk. Actually, cloud's pretty good for most, or not for everybody, but it's really good security for most organizations. Of course, what you're doing there is shipping them into an oligopoly of basically 3 companies, and there is that risk. Then you get into things about, I don't want to use the word cartels, but you get into things like antitrust and all of that, and so on. So there is something about Yeah, there is something about consolidation, and there is something about individual versus sort of aggregate incentives. I do accept that. You know, sending people into a monoculture is a risk. And so again, there's something there for governments to think about. You know, if the individual incentive on individual organisations is to fuel a monoculture, to fuel an oligopoly, then you know you have to think about imaginative ways of dealing with that.
And then someone, Steve, wanting to follow up on what you said about the supply chains, essentially. Yeah. All of our IT kit and systems, I think that I would say a lot of our IT kits and systems are provided by non-UK companies, yeah. Either US, particularly the cloud, or China with Internet of Things, and there are some other players, of course. How do we get good cyber security where we do not control the infrastructure or the endpoints?
So, I mean, there's 2 points to that. One is we've got to, because we can scale to that. There are some things in this country that are built entirely of UK component parts. They are specified in defence industrial strategies. They are very few because it's enormously expensive to do. So, you know, it's not going to scale, even for the 5th, 6th largest economy in the world. So we have to do this. There are then, I think, 2 or 3 points. One is there is, I think, a political consensus that there is a difference between allied and more authoritarian partners in this respect, and that an allied approach provides more assurance on security than the alternative. But the challenge with that is that, and this is a slightly sort of obsessively geeky point of mine, but I feel very strongly about it. And you know, it's very easy to say, well, we should just cooperate with our allies on, you know, tech security. Actually, it's not very easy to do. So cooperating in defence is really easy. I mean, conceptually anyway, and sort of administratively, you have a meeting of leaders. Let's say it's a NATO summit, they agree something, and NATO's got a huge bureaucracy, it's huge headquarters in Brussels, hundreds, thousands of people working there. And you go back and say, look, the NATO summit's agreed this, go and do this. And out of the 30 ministries of defence of NATO countries do their bits and so forth. Or, you know, the British and French agree a defence pact, and the 2 ministries of defence work together and do stuff. You want to do strategic telecoms infrastructure for the age of 6G. So you agree, where would you agree that? You probably agree that in the G7. Say, right, and the G7 did this in Cornwall in 2021. They didn't mention 6G, but they said, for the technologies of the future, we're going to make sure that there's allied technological industrial base for the free world. What happens then? Who implements the G7 communique? Well, there's no standing body for the G7, it's just a meeting, doesn't even have a secretariat. And then the sort of policy measures that flow from that sort of thing, they're not for defence ministries, they're for treasury ministries, economics ministries, business ministries, trade ministries and so forth, who tend not to cooperate, they tend to actually compete. Or when the trade ministries have pretty vicious negotiations with each other. I remember during the Huawei crisis, and I won't say which politician it was, I remember senior politicians saying to me, you guys need to go and work with your Five Eyes counterparts to build alternatives to Huawei. I remember thinking, so I'm supposed to ring up the National Security Agency of the United States and say, fancy building a telco to go and take on this Chinese giant? It's just not the way the world works. So I'm not sort of criticizing politicians. I'm saying we don't appreciate how hard it is to us. Then the final point, we've got through, this must be a record. So there's a game of bingo in cybersecurity circles about how long can you go through a cybersecurity event without using the phrase zero trust. And the answer is we've been going for 87 of the allotted 90 minutes, and we haven't mentioned zero trust, which in percentage and absolute terms must be the record. But there is a thing about, zero, about not trusting anything. So you build a set of things that just don't rely on anything else.
Yeah.
So they've got their own security.
Okay, which is the way universities have to operate in some ways.
Kinda.
Okay, so I'll ask one more question from. Are there any more questions from the audience? Perhaps I want to just check that. I've got a few more here, but I think in view of time, I'll ask one more. So, how do we encourage cyber professionals into government service to tackle these complex challenges when the private sector will pay so much more? Basically?
Right. I'm glad you chose this as the last one because it allows me to finish on the optimistic stuff again. When a bunch of us came up with the idea of having a National Cybersecurity Centre, a very wise old owl at GCHU said to me, you shouldn't do this because there's not enough skills here, there's not enough skills in the economy. And I really liked this guy's advice and so on, but I was really glad that the bunch of us with this project just decided for once in our lives to ignore it. Whinging about skills is the great Cassandra of cybersecurity, and everybody does it. And it's not to say there's no basis in it. Of course, there's a huge basis, and everybody's struggling to get it. But what are you going to do? You either keep whinging about it or go off and do something. And for a start, let's break it down. It always helps to break it down. You don't need a million state-of-the-art technical experts in this country. You need more than a handful. You do need millions of people with basic proficiency in it. That's a different set of challenges, but it's in some respect, in scale, it's harder to do. In terms of education, much easier to do if you get it right. You need a bunch of people in between. So you just think about it in that way. Secondly, a combination of, frankly, idealism and sense of mission, but also a bit of flexibility. So we did every so often, you get the gut-wrenching news in my old job, you get the gut-wrenching news that one of your best people had been poached for some astronomical salary with which you could not possibly compete because it was twice what the Prime Minister earned. I don't know, just when that happens, you're done. There's no but very often people would refuse such things. And there were two reasons. One was, really three. One was, in that place where I was, I heard the word mission used, which initially I thought, is this sort of thing, they're winding me up. They really meant it. They did have a sense of mission, and that kept them going. Secondly, more prosaically, they were allowed to play with the train set that the private sector wasn't allowed to play with, and it was really interesting work. And finally, there was a pragmatism in the rules, which meant that over time, you weren't allowed to pay them Google salaries, but you were allowed to pay them more than a mainstream civil servant at the same grade, and that cushioned the blow. But also gave people a sense of recognition. So there are things you can do. Was it perfect? No. Did you lose people to the private sector? Yeah, all the time. Did you have enough to get by and do something useful? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. On that optimistic note, draw proceedings to a close. Thank you so much for the talk and for your answers to the questions. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have.
Well, thank you, and thank you everybody for your patience and endurance. I think I know there are other things you're going to announce, but also I feel like I feel like saying you're free to go.
No, I don't know if I have any other announcements. I know that the bar over below reception will be open if anyone wants to go there afterwards. But I think the main thing I've got to do is to thank you once again, both for the audience here today and the audience online who won't be able to applaud so easily, but I'm sure they will be equally grateful to you for what you've told us.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.